historical data on school district bond and override election results. One part of the rationale for this is there's been a lot of questions, especially after the election, about how are bond and override elections working compared to how they historically have been in terms of success and failure. We thought it would be really good to have that kind of information, so whether you have an override that you're going to come up for renewal, or you're thinking about having a new override, or whatever it may be, at least you have an understanding of what's happened over the years. So that's the purpose of our webinar today. Before we get started, I want to welcome Tim Ogle, who's the Executive Director for the Arizona School Boards Association, who's with us today. This webinar is co-sponsored by the School Boards Association and the Arizona Association of School Business Officials. So we appreciate Tim and ASBA's support in these efforts. You've seen the title for today's webinar. Hopefully you'll have a better understanding. I think ASBO for this upcoming year, one of our themes is going to be facts versus fiction. There's a lot of things that are out there where people talk about school funding and school finance issues, and some things are factual and some things are fiction. And hopefully after today you'll have the facts on what's really happened with override and bond elections over the past few years. With us today we have Judy Richardson and Randy Stein from Stiefel, Nicholas and Company. Heard the pause on that. I wanted to make sure I pronounced it correctly. And our first presenter will be Randy Stein. So Randy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Chuck. I just want to welcome you myself to the presentation. Thank ASBO as well as ASBA for having us here today. As you've been told, I'm Randy Stein. I'm also with Judy Richardson. We are both vice presidents with Stiefel Nicholas, and we have been for several years now, although in previous lives we did both serve on the staff of the Arizona State Senate and have remained involved in legislative and obviously school finance issues over the years. So as we get started, let me, warn you that this is a complicated and dynamic subject with a lot of moving pieces. If you're here for magic answers, unfortunately, we do not have those today. We're still working on magic answers. But I think we do have some interesting information that you'll be able to think about and consider in the context of your own school district as you go forward, contemplate elections over the next few years. So let's get started. I'm on page 1, and this is sort of the big picture of what the election approval rates have been over about the past decade. Passage rates were down for all types of elections in the 2007 to 2012 period compared to the 2003 to 2007 period. Interestingly, in 2013, overrides did better than they had done in the previous 5 years, and capital overrides even did better than they had done between 2003 for the 2003 to 2007 average. In 2013, all types of school district questions had approximately the same pass rate. All types of questions were essentially averaged into the early 60s with respect to the passage rate. This is a bad passage rate for bonds. It is a good passage rate for M&O override elections and a really good pass rate for capital override elections. If you focus in on the capital override elections, pretty much, rarely were we getting 50% of capital override questions to pass during an election cycle. So to see in 2013 that 63% of those questions passed was in fact quite an improvement. On page 2, some of the factors that may have impacted the election passage rates after May 2007. Page 2 deals with some of the negative factors. We'll also talk about some of the factors we can't really put a finger on as to whether they're negative or positive. We did start seeing large changes in property values in 2007, which in some cases taxpayers saw pretty significant increases in their tax bills, which since that time period just may have made taxpayers a little bit shy when they went to vote for all kinds of elections in school, including school districts, and may have been more reluctant to vote yes as a result. One of the other factors, starting in November of 2007, override elections were limited to that November time period. No longer were school districts allowed to hold elections in the March, May, and September time period. So I think what previously some school districts had employed as the fly under the radar strategy, go with an election where not very many people are paying attention, couldn't be done anymore. That also may have impacted election pass rates since 2007. We, of course, can't dismiss the economic events that started in 2008. Obviously, homeowners, property taxpayers, citizens were facing financial difficulty. I think people had a concern about job uncertainty. In addition, as a result of the dramatic declines that we started seeing in property values, property tax rates started increasing. Again, this may have had a negative impact on the passage of school district elections since 2007. Also, for the override category, we've kind of got a statistical anomaly. Starting in 2009, we no longer had cash balance overrides. Cash balance overrides had a zero impact on the tax rate and were highly likely to pass. So anytime there was this type of override question, or more than one school district had this type of override question during the election cycle, it sort of padded our statistics on the number of questions that were passing. The other thing that we have to point to since May of 2007, high school districts and unified school districts could then have 15% M&O override elections. For the high school districts, while of course the 15% applies to the elementary school districts as well, for the high school districts and the unified districts, a 15% M&O override is actually an increase in the amount of the override. The high school districts, because prior to that they never had access to the 5% K-3 override, and the unified districts, because the application of the 15% was to the full K-12 RCL, not the separated K-12 for the 10% and the 5% override being applicable to the K-8 RCL.
Randy, on the cash balance overrides, just to refresh people's memory, those were mainly impact aid districts, so they already had the money on hand. They just needed the authorization to
exactly, and so they showed as a zero tax rate. I mean, and maybe Judy can remember, I don't think we ever saw one of those fail.
No, they always passed, and so they did inflate the statistics in those years a little bit, and we didn't even think about it when we were doing the statistics at the time, but it's a factor that has caused the overall passage rate to go down a little bit.
Because those elections no longer happen. Okay, I am on page 3. I promised you a preview of some of the factors that are out there that have changed since 2007. We don't necessarily think these factors have had a negative impact. We don't know that they've had a positive impact. What I would emphasize, though, is I think in all of these issues we're about to discuss, these issues are evolving, and they may have had a negative impact in 2007 and may in fact have had a positive impact in 2013, or maybe getting there for 2015. These things are still changing and sort of working their way into the election process. And you know, we can start with the election process issues. Probably the most significant is the coming into being of the permanent early voting list, the PEVL. I don't know if any of you ever heard anyone call PEVL is the devil, suggesting that PEVL was in fact making it much harder for school districts to pass elections. I think that we'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation. I think that might have been true in the 2007, 2008, 2009 time frame. I'm not convinced that that's still the case, and I'm certainly not convinced that that's going to be the case 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. With respect to election process, all mail elections are coming into vogue, somewhat tied to the PEVL because there is a cost component there, but all mail elections is sort of a new way to present, and it is a new way to contemplate voter advertising for both the pro side as well as the con side. So again, this is something that is evolving, has evolved over the last 5 years, and will continue to do so. The other issue we've seen recently is multiple polling places for various jurisdictional elections. Some cities had these community voting centers when school districts were doing all-mail ballots. I think this was confusing. And again, as the election process continues to evolve, I think we probably have several more years where it is confusing to voters as to how they vote, where they vote, and if they voted for everything they're eligible to vote for. Although hopefully within the next 5 years, the jurisdictions will come together with the counties and we'll have something that is more acceptable and easier for voters to execute their privilege of voting. We've also seen voter pamphlet changes, several of which have placed a greater emphasis on the total cost to homeowners in bond pamphlets. This may have had an impact on passage rates. The continuation language for the maintenance and operation overrides, this is new. You know, you now get to have a tagline that says override continuation, yes, as opposed to budget increase, yes. Anecdotally, we think this would have had a positive impact on passage rates. And then we've talked a little bit on the previous slide about the combining of the 10% and the 5% overrides. I don't know if this is a positive or a negative impact. For an elementary school district, you have the opportunity to ask a single question to get a 15% override, as opposed to having to ask 2 different questions, but you're asking a bigger question. So I think that issue could cut both ways. And then finally, the limitation on capital overrides to 10% of the revenue control limit has come into being in the last few years. And this piece likely has had a positive impact because we were certainly aware of several school districts that had capital overrides that certainly far exceeded 10% of the revenue control limit. On page 4, I want to remind you that, of course, the mix of districts holding elections in any given year clearly affects the statistics for that year. The most notable example we've already discussed with the cash balance overrides. Also want to point out that there are district factors that affect election results. Tax-based configuration, if a school district is heavily residential, if it's heavily commercial property, voter income level seems to have some sort of impact on passage rates in districts. And I would, sort of look at these two together. There are 2 items that a school district really has no control over. You've got the tax-based configuration that you've got, and sometimes I see results that I consider to be counterintuitive. I often find that school districts where the voter income levels are actually the lowest seem to have some of the highest pass rates. Other factors individual to school districts, home values, the changes in home values, taxpayer attitudes towards taxes. This may be the single biggest impediment in some school districts to having successful bond and override elections. How the public perceives the school district, how the newspaper perceives the school district, and of course, how much effort goes into a pro committee, and by the same token, how much effort goes into a con committee, or how much publicity is out there encouraging people to vote against school district bond and override elections. All school districts are different. All school districts are changing over time. The bad news is that there's no statistically relevant database that leads to a step-by-step process for successful elections. But the good news is you know what you're working with, and I think we've got several ideas as we go through the statistics for the individual types of elections that will give you a little bit more information and some election configurations that we seem to have a little bit better possibility of passage based on the type of district. With that, I will turn it over to Judy to start discussing the maintenance and operation override results.
Okay, thank you, Randy. On page 5, you can see some additional breakdown on M&O and K3 and special program override results. You can see that the 61% passage rate for this year was significantly better than both 2011 and 2012. Not too different from the 10-year average or what we've seen since November 2007, but certainly less than those earlier 5-year periods, again, which was before all the changes that Randy had mentioned.
Judy, is 40, we noticed that for 2013 there were 46 M&O override questions. Is that a lot? It's certainly a lot higher than 2011 or 2012.
It is, and I think it's high in part because we had failures in 2011 and 2012, and so people were trying again. So whenever you've had a year of failures, then in subsequent years you have a few more. Okay, moving on. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of increasing your override amount for those districts that are requesting a renewal. There's 3 kinds of override increases. One is simply increasing from 10% to 15%. This could be a high school district going for a 15% override, or it could be an elementary or a unified district that never had a K3 override but now wants to go to the 15%. The other type is the one that Randy mentioned earlier, which is a unified district that has a 5% K3 and a 10% M&O. If they combine it into a 15, it's going to be an increase because of the change in the RCL basis for the 5% component. And to avoid that, several districts this year did not go for the full 15. They went from 13 to 13.3%, depending on how they calculated it. But in all cases, they were able to call it a continuing override because it was not increasing the amount. And then finally, the other type of override that we group as one that's requesting an increase is those in which the override has already started to phase down. And this almost always means that a previous override attempt failed. So of course those are harder to pass because there's a negative history there. Moving on, let's look at the passage rates for the different types of overrides, M&O overrides, in 2013. 3 were completely new, and 1 of them passed for 33% rate. This is not surprising. A new override is the hardest to pass because it's a clear tax increase. The good news is 1 passed, so it is possible to pass a new override. Don't give up without even trying. 43 of the ones this year were renewals, and 63% passed. Of these, 12 requested an increase, and only 25% of them passed. So you can see that clearly requesting an increase is the hardest thing to pass. Of the 12, 2 were early, which means that those districts, there were only 2, 1 passed, so the other one at least can try again next year without having to deal with the phase down. 2 were on time, so, and again, 1 passed, which means that the other, maybe because they went for an increase, is now going to, their existing override is going to start phasing down. And then 8 of the districts in that group were already phasing down, and only 1 of those passed. And not surprising, that's sort of the lowest passage rate of any of the groups we're looking at. But again, these are the districts that probably lost their attempt last year or the year before, or both. 30 of the overrides this year were requesting the same amount. And as Randy mentioned, we call this continuing overrides because they're allowed to have a different ballot that says override continuation. And 77% of those passed, which is a very, very good passage rate. 1 district requested a lower override amount, and it also passed. This is very unusual. I don't know why they did it. I didn't help with that override, but if you want to be sure your override passes, I guess you should ask for less. Interestingly enough, 2012 results were similar for the different types. In other words, in 2012, also the ones that were renewing at the same level also had a much higher passage rate. And what's interesting is that this year, in 2013, 65% of all override renewals were continuing, whereas in 2012, only 39% were. So when you think about why did 2013 do a lot better than 2012, part of the answer is in 2013, more of the districts were requesting continuing overrides, and those have the highest success rate.
Did either one of you look at, like after Election Day, as more votes were counted, it seemed to be positive for districts?
Chuck is stealing my thunder.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I defer you?
You can,
okay.
you can defer to that.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Interesting issue.
Okay, moving on to capital outlay override election results. This year was 63% approval, as Randy said. Similar to last year, it was also very similar. 2011 was lower, and the average is closer to 50%, as Randy mentioned. And we've been tracking even years versus odd years for overrides because except for this year and last year, there's been a tendency for the odd years to do better with capital overrides. Moving on to the next slide. Capital outlay override renewals right now, this year and last year, are often decreases because of the cap on the RCL that was enacted. So, and as we saw with the M&O overrides, when you ask for a decrease, there's a good chance of passing. So that may be helping improve the capital outlay overrides that are renewals if people are asking for less than they had in the past. Even though it's probably not a tax rate, well, it could be a tax rate decrease. Yes, it could. Because that 10% cap only applies to new overrides. It didn't apply to a previous override. Okay, and interestingly enough, though, this year, of the capital overrides, 6 were completely new, and of those, 3 passed. So that was very good news. 1 was partially new, and 1 renewal was a decrease. And 2012 results were very similar in terms of 50% of the new overrides passing, and a good percentage of the renewals also passing. Moving on to bonds. As Randy indicated, the 64% passage rate for bonds was the lowest we've ever had. Last year was 89%, the previous year 71%. Our average since the very beginning of Class B bonds is about 90%, and if we compare the even and the odd years, bonds seem to be doing a little better in the even years than the odd years, although historically it's been pretty good in both.
And we should, we used to quote this statistic quite a bit, but in fact the even numbered years, which are the big election years, which school districts had sometimes shied away from going to the ballot because there was so much attention to the election, so many people would be voting, but I think it was certainly since Students First through I think 2008, those general election years for bonds had a 100% pass rate in the even years.
Right. Until
2008 was still 100%, even 2008 was 100% pass rate. It wasn't until 2010 that it dipped.
Right. Okay, let's move on to slide 11. So I guess the question is, if the bond rate went down, whereas everything else was better this year, is that any sort of a concern for bond election? And I'm not sure that it is, because first of all, the 64% passage rate is not all that different from the 71% in 2011, with a relatively small number of elections, which was 11. And because some communities are more strongly anti-tax, the mix of districts is going to affect the results in any one year. As Randy indicated, all the factors that cause some districts to be more favorable of bonds and overrides than others, we don't want to overreact too much to any one year. And this year, one of the failures was very close. It was over 49% yes, and if that had squeaked by with a few more votes, then the percentage would have been increased significantly because it was a small number of districts. And one possible factor to think about with bond elections is the projected tax rate increase. And by that I mean the change from the current year bond tax rate to what the first year tax rate would be in the district. Because as you know, when you do a bond election, you put in a table that shows the tax impact over the life of the bond, and the tax rate isn't always exactly even in all of those years. And a lot of the pamphlet emphasizes the average annual tax rate, which is different from the first year tax increase. But I want to talk a little bit about just that first year tax increase, because it seemed to be the one factor that I could see as I looked at the voter pamphlets that was the only thing that was different between the bonds that passed and the bonds that failed. And that is, of the bonds that passed, when you just looked at the change between the first year bond tax rate and the current tax rate, that change ranged from a -9%, meaning in that district they were projecting the tax rate to go down, to a 28% increase. And of the bonds that failed, the range in increases was 24 to 73%. Plus, there was one district that failed that had a 0 current tax rate. And so you can't do a percentage increase when you're starting from 0, but that would be perceived by the voters as a big increase. Anytime you're starting from 0, it's a bigger increase. And interestingly enough, it was only the percentage increase that made the difference. It wasn't the actual tax rate. This one that failed, it started with 0, it was only going to 45 cents. And one that passed, had a tax rate of over $1. So it wasn't the magnitude of the tax rate. It seems to be the only factor that I could identify was the percentage increase over the current. And if you think about it, that's all the voters care about. They don't know whether their tax rate is higher or lower than anybody else's. They just compare their tax rate with what it was the prior year. They're always concerned about how their taxes are increasing, and they tend to assume that a tax rate increase means a tax bill increase, even if it doesn't, because their AV may be going down. And the reason why this could possibly be a factor is that in previous elections, before SAVs started going down so much, we very often had no projected tax rate increase. We had many more bond elections, in that 99 to 2008 time period, where we were not projecting any tax rate increase because assessed valuations were growing, and we could feather in the debt service for new bonds without increasing the tax rate. So that might be something that you might like to think about if you're thinking about a bond election. It's not so much the magnitude of the tax rates, but the percentage increase over the current year. And the other thing that we noticed was that the average annual tax rate, which is the tax rate associated with just the new bonds, was very similar for those that passed and those that failed. 37 cents for those that passed and 43 cents for the failures. Obviously, it helps to have a smaller tax increase, but that doesn't seem to be the primary factor. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of 2 questions at one election. And for this, I have to thank Lou Wiegand, who sent me an email asking about this, because he noticed that in the 2013 election results, it looked like a lot of districts who have 2 questions, like a bond and an override or 2 overrides, they seem to pass more than the people who just asked 1 question, whether it was a bond or an override. So we did a little analysis, and it shows that indeed in 2013, if you compare the questions, the first table here is just the question itself, the bond question or the override. So there were 49 questions that stood alone as single questions for that district versus 16 pairs, 16 questions that were paired. And the ones that were paired passed at a 75% passage rate, whereas only 57% of the single questions passed. And we also went back 2 years so that we could get a little bigger sample size. And so if you look at 2011, the total from 2011 through 2013, you can see that the total for the 3 years, you still have a better passage rate, 65%, for the questions that were paired, as compared to the 49% passage rate for the questions that were single. And then looking at it in a different way, we're starting with the districts who asked 2 questions. So there's 8 districts that asked 2 questions. That corresponds to the previous table. There were 16 questions, but 8 districts. Okay. So of the 8 districts who had 2 questions, 63% passed both, 25% passed one, and 13% failed both. And you can see the results for 12 and 11. And 11 was quite different in that it was just a more negative year, with 43% of them failing both. But when you total it over the 3 years, you can see that the majority, 52%, that had 2 questions actually passed both. Then moving on to the next page, we analyzed it a slightly different way. In this table, we're looking at it by type of question. And because there weren't that many bonds in 1 year that were paired with something else, this is a summary of all 3 years, but by type of question. So for bonds over that 3-year period, 22 of the questions were single, and 68% of them passed. 12 were paired with another question, and 83% of them passed. Capital override, it looks like it didn't make a lot of difference, 54% versus 58%. But for M&O and special program overrides, you find same trend as with bonds, 44% passing as a single question and 59% passing as a double question. And the total of the 3 years, you can see the 49% passing as a single versus 65% as a pair. So this definitely suggests that there's certainly no problem with having 2 questions on the ballot. The second question isn't going to hurt your chances of passing the first, and the first isn't necessarily going to hurt your chances of passing the second. And actually, for the bonds and overrides, the passage rate was higher for the questions that were paired. Now, I don't think this means that having 2 questions on the ballot somehow makes both easier to pass. Like if you're going for a bond and you want to be sure it passes, adding an override. I don't think it's quite that simple. Next page. Because I think it's possible that the districts who, in the past, who decided to have 2 questions on the ballot may be those that have a better history of passing elections and therefore are comfortable trying 2 questions. And I would also say that it depends on your timing, but if rather than having a bond election 1 year and an M&O override the next, or vice versa, maybe there is some advantage to pairing them so that you can focus all of your energy and your resources in one election instead of trying to, get people energized and motivated and raise money for 2 elections 1 year after the other. So.
Now, Judy, just to put you on the spot, we're talking about school districts that have 2 bond and override questions on the same election cycle ballot. It rarely happens, but occasionally we see a school district with 3. What do you know about 3?
Well, nobody has done 3 lately, so I didn't include it in this. But the last time I looked at it, we did find that the percentage of yes trails off, typically. So that whatever order they're in, the third one will get a lower yes percentage than the first 2. And we've had districts in the past that have had 4 because they had a bond, M&O, K3, and capital outlay. And it happens the same with 4. They trail off in whatever order they're in. Although we have had successful elections with 3 and 4 questions. But again, it probably has to be the kind of district that has a really good history of passing elections, and then you can certainly save a lot of money and time and effort by having everything all at once.
Okay, the next section of the presentation is on page 16 and the discussion about all male elections. This is more often used in odd-numbered years, and primarily that's because of the cost issue. We'll discuss that a little bit further in a moment. Pima County had done a decent analysis with respect to 2011, indicated that with all male elections, they saw an increased voter turnout. That seems somewhat intuitive. The ballot is in your house, it's in your hand, it's easy to do. It doesn't require a stamp. You don't have to go anyplace, so it's very easy to do, and you can understand why that would increase voter turnout. They've also sort of determined that the percent of your voters that are on the permanent early voting list, the PEVL, if that threshold gets to approximately 50%, it's likely to be more cost-effective to hold an all-male election. And then they also found that, at least for the 2011 year, that the all-male elections seem to improve the results for school districts. Let's go back and talk about the cost issue for a minute so that everybody understands that. Mailing ballots to the PEVL list is not cheap. They have a cost for that. They have $1 per ballot. So if you've reached this threshold of around 50% of your voters on the PEVL, and you have to mail to that 50% anyway, it seems as though the cost of doing an all-mail ballot, mailing to the other 50% of your voters, seems to be smaller than mailing to your PEVL list and having all polling places staffed. Now, of course, the staffing of the polling places is somewhat, the cost of the staffing of the polling places is somewhat influenced by the other jurisdictions that are holding elections on the same day and using the same location. School districts can spread the cost with a city or a fire district or whoever else is voting. But clearly, they seem to think that at about the 50% level, you really have to examine it if you're concerned about the cost aspect. If you're not doing an all-male election, all those polling places have to be staffed, and the PEVL list has to be mailed to. If you opt for all-mail, you still have to mail to the PEVL list, but you also mail to the remaining voters, but your costs associated with a polling place are virtually non-existent. And the notion of improving, the notion that the all-male elections are improving the results, I think they did. I think clearly in Pima County they saw that in 2011. I think that this is one of the evolving issues that we talked about, started discussing at the very beginning of the presentation. I think originally the theory was that the first people who joined the permanent early voting list may have been sort of the vote no crowd. They were voting no on anything and everything. They wanted to make sure that they had their ballots. They wanted it to be easy, and they were just always going to vote no. So the idea that you would do an all-mail election, so you would be sending to your PEVL vote no crowd, but you'd also be getting the ballots into the hands of the rest of your voters who are more likely to be voting yes. You're making it easier for them so that they don't have to go to the polling places. They're on the same playing field as the PEVL, and I think they did see improved results in 2011. But as PEVL has evolved, and there's some, the numbers are increasing pretty dramatically as to the percent of the voter rolls that are on the PEVL. As the PEVL evolves, and it's really more mainstream and looks a lot more like the regular voting population, I don't know that you're getting the same bang out of an all-male election as you did 3 or 4 years ago when the PEVL was really small and was probably that anti-everything crowd. So basically, I think you're less likely to see improved results in an all-male election as more of your high efficacy voters, your people who are voting all the time, are on the PEVL anyway. Maricopa County, their analysis from February of this year, they really were seeing virtually all of the school districts were at this 50% PEVL level. And again, we're confirming the the information from Pima County that the cost for the school district elections could be reduced and could in fact be less if you opted for an all-mail election, as we've discussed the split on the cost between the two types of elections. The next page shows some results from the all-mail elections. This is just 2013, not a lot of information, and again, I think this will, I don't think this is something that's necessarily going to hold into the future. I guess a couple things that are notable. Mail elections did better than poll elections in Maricopa County. Poll elections did better than mail elections in the other counties. But you'll also note that the Maricopa County poll election pass rate was higher than the poll election pass rate in all other counties, and the Maricopa mail election pass rate was also higher than the mail election pass rate in the other counties. I don't think this is, anything to pin any kind of decision on that, well, we can definitely get a pass if we go with a mail election. But it's certainly worth considering, certainly worth considering the costs associated with it, and considering it in the context of your own individual district. Obviously, the best comparison would be, a side-by-side mail and poll election for the same school district. Obviously, not going to happen, but that would really be the only way to know if that was the deciding factor on the passage of an election for an individual school district. On page 19, just to summarize some of the information, clearly for 2013, renewals at the same level have the highest passage rates, and we're at a higher percentage, and a higher percentage of 2013 M&O elections were renewals at the same level. So we did see improved passage rates for 2013. The 2013 bond results were disappointing, but not necessarily suggesting a problem for 2014. One of the issues that we're definitely facing and will be for a couple of years is that despite all conversation over the past 3, 4, 5 years about tax impact versus tax rate, we seem to clearly have voters still focused on tax rates, and that when they see tax rates increasing, it does not occur to them that it's possible that your tax rate can increase and your actual tax impact could decrease. That's just, we've talked about it. I think Judy and I have talked about it till we're blue in the face, but that just doesn't seem to be resonating. Obviously, it's difficult to explain, and as Judy pointed out, with the first-year impact, particularly on that bond pamphlet, where you can see what next year's tax rate is going to be compared to this year's, that seems to be having an impact. We don't think there's any evidence discouraging school districts from putting 2 questions on the same ballot, bond and override. They're certainly not failing at any greater rate than the single question. And the mail elections certainly merit further study, and it is all tied, it's also all tied to the evolution of the permanent early voting list. There are cost considerations, and then getting back to Chuck's question, Chuck noticed this year, as I did, particularly in Maricopa County, they start counting votes on Tuesday night of election night, and they literally are not done until after close of business on Friday. I think this year they finished between 7 and 8 o'clock at night on Friday. And what I noticed, as Chuck brought up earlier, is that as the week went on, it seemed that school district elections that looked like on Wednesday morning that they had failed had in fact passed. And when you got to Thursday, they had a bigger pass rate. And when you got to Friday, it was an even bigger pass rate than that. There was one high school district in particular that I woke up Wednesday morning, it looked like it had passed a big high school district by about 50 votes. Well, by the time they had finished counting all the ballots on Friday, it seemed they were well in the pass range. if you'd seen, you know, a 52, 53% pass rate, you wouldn't have been worried on Wednesday morning. And I made a phone call, wanted to see what was going on. And what I'm finding out about the ballots that are counted last, they are actually the mail ballots that have arrived at the elections department on Tuesday, on election day, or the mail ballots that are dropped off at a polling place on Tuesday. Why is this? Well, the mail ballots that come in early, the county starts processing them immediately. The mail ballots need two things. They need a signature verification. So they go through a process. Somebody literally verifies the signature on the ballot with the signature on the voter's record to make sure it's legitimate. Once the signature verification has happened, that vote can be counted. So a mail ballot that comes in early, they're counting in the week beforehand. Those are easy. If you go to a polling place and vote, you vote. They do the signature verification when you check in at the polling place. So you vote and you put it in the machine and your vote is counted right that day. It is counted. So by the time they get to 7 o'clock and the polls close, they can announce this. These mail ballots that are late, they take signature verification. And what they told me is, again, somebody has to physically look at the signature on the ballot, signature on your electronic voting record to see if they match, and then they start counting them. So this is what can take 48 or 72 more hours. What this told me, though, is that, you know, I sort of had always had the impression once we started this early voting process years ago that that sort of shifted the whole election cycle back 30 days, and that it was sort of an early person's game. You had to be out there, you know, you had to be out there in early October with your support for the election, and the signs had to be up and the information going to voters' mailboxes. What this tells me is that it's really a late game, and that there are people who are holding mail ballots and deciding how they're going to vote at the very last minute. And so this notion of focusing all, you know, a pro committee focusing all their energy in early October and letting it wane through the month until election day, I think is not a good idea. I think that pro committee has to stay focused. There are good votes still out there right up until the day of election day. I think that's what this information tells us. Those are the ballots that they're counting last, and those seem to be the ballots that we're really turning for school districts, at least this year.
Yeah, they would seem to be more positive.
Absolutely.
The earlier ones, and maybe the message, as you said, is important that the pro committees keep working, and those last couple of days remind people, if you haven't mailed your ballot in, you can take it to the poll, but get it in.
Right, and I think, you know, maybe that tells us that your no's are doing it. You know, your no's have already voted. Who you're reaching in those last few days may be your most likely guesses, and those are the ones you need.
Okay. Now, if you want to take a quick look at, there's the questions that we've gotten in. I neglected earlier, which I seem to do quite often.
You're getting older.
I'm getting older. Well, then I'm not going to say anything nice about you, Ernie. I would have said we really appreciate Ernie Nicely and his providing a technical support to us to make these webinars possible. But since he was making smart remarks about me, I'll withdraw that. No, we really do appreciate Ernie. These would not work without him if they had to depend on me. You'd get about 2% of the information that you get, and the rest of it would be apologizing why we screwed things up. So we do appreciate Ernie doing this for us. So Randy, if you want to read their questions, and I don't know if you and Judy want to decide who answers which one, or both of you try to answer them. We just have a few.
Okay, let me just hit a couple easy ones quickly. One of the questions is whether you can have an all-mail election if another jurisdiction is having a polling place. The answer is yes. The answer is very confusing for voters. I'm not sure voters necessarily realize that, you know, what you received in the mail in your house is what you vote for the school district, and then you have to go someplace else to vote for your city. So right now that can happen. I'm guessing over the next 10 years the election process will streamline a little bit so that we won't see that. We also have a question about, someone's indicated that in Yavapai County they were told that the threshold for the cost effectiveness of the all-mail ballot is an 80% number of registered voters on the permanent early voting list. And that may very well, in fact, be the case in Yavapai County. I think once, in any county, once you're up to the 50% threshold, you should be looking at it for that specific election. Also remember that if you're not doing an all-mail, if you're doing a polling place, if you're the only jurisdiction holding an election, you're paying for everything that's needed to have all those polling places open. If there are other jurisdictions joining you in the election, you're splitting that cost. So that number is going to change from election to election. The point, though, is when you've got a significant number of voters on that permanent early voting list, you have to mail to them. In Yavapai County, they're indicating that this was about $2.25 per ballot, and that is similar to what we hear for Maricopa County as well. It's expensive. It's definitely expensive. That cost is going to happen no matter what. Those people are on the permanent early voting list.
And I'd just like to add that in Yavapai County, they were told that it's only 75 cents a ballot for people to go to the polling place. But I was also told, I think in Pima County, and I would think it would apply statewide as well, that you also have to print, if you're having a polling place, you have to print ballots not just for the non-Pebble people, but you have to print ballots for everybody. Because the people who got an early ballot, they can still go to the polling place and vote. They might have to go to provisional ballot, so they check that they didn't already mail one in. But you end up printing a lot more ballots if you have a polling place, because you do have to print extra ballots, not just for those who aren't on the list. And we did have a question about what Pebble means, and I hope by now you all know that Pebble stands for Permanent Early Voting List. We had another question, do you have data for elementary and high school districts separately? No, we don't. We could separate out the elementaries, but in any one election, we just don't have that many union high school districts. But we could certainly do that, and it would be interesting. So we can add that to something to look at in the future.
And actually, I assume that writer is from a high school district, although I don't know. But if you wanted more information on high school districts, you could contact us. We could certainly give you some of our election reports, which wouldn't take too much time to look through, and you could get some information about high school districts, I think, pretty easily.
Yeah, or if you're elementary and wanted to see that.
There's a lot more elementaries, yeah, a lot more. There's also a question about the political action committees using election consultants, and while Judy and I don't really get involved much with that, I think the answer is there are quite a few political action committees that do use election consultants. We won't name any at this point. There's probably 3, 4, 5 pretty significant ones in the state. But yes, I do think that's a pretty common practice among the political action committees. And using an election consultant, I think, can vary to degree. It could be, a small assistance with preparing a mailer to, sort of running the whole pro committee, the pro effort for the political action committee. So I think it can vary in degree very widely, but I think it's a common practice that those election consultants are used for the cycle.
And people just need to be, districts need to be really careful that more so than in the past, there's groups watching to make sure that you're not spending any of your public money or using any district resources to influence the outcome of an election. And if you, in fact, it's interesting, even if you just get charged with doing that, even if you did, it really hurts your election because it gets people in the community in a negative mood. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use them, but you want to make sure that they are totally separate from your district.
And that, yes, that their relationship is with the political action committee. It's never with the district.
Right, and we have no way of knowing which districts had, action committees that hired a consultant. So it would be nice if we did, then we could see if they have a higher passage rate, but we don't have access to that data. And then we had one more question about small rural districts. We haven't separated them out. You can, look at the statistics for Maricopa County, and you can see that it is a little more difficult outside of Maricopa County to pass elections. That doesn't mean that they don't pass. We certainly know of examples of small rural districts that have passed bonds and overrides, so it's certainly possible. And again, as Randy said, if you wanted to, we'd be happy to send you some, historical lists of who's passed and who hasn't, and you can look for districts that you might be interested in.
A question has just come up about how the law has changed with regard to restricting school districts from expressing an opinion on elections. Consult an attorney on this. The one thing that we will say is that the fine has increased this year for violations along these lines. I believe the previous fine was $500 and the fine has increased to $5,000. So this is getting pretty serious. And this is, the bond lawyers in the area have discussed this. They'll discuss it with anybody who asks them. One simple question and they can run on this for a good 20 minutes. And they've encountered some very interesting situations, but this is something that a district that is pursuing an election should be well aware of. You should have this consult with your bond lawyer to make sure that you are doing this properly.
And I think the School Boards Association put out some very good direction for districts on do's and don'ts, but it's probably always good to double check because this is one area where you don't want to inadvertently or get in trouble, and not only the fine, but just what perception it carries forth to your community.
There's one more question. I'm reading it. It's a long question.
Okay, that'll be our last one.
Okay.
Well, it's about changing election laws, in particular whether the 35-day mail-in deadline for voter pamphlets maybe should be changed because it's only 9 days before the early ballots are mailed out.
And obviously, well, I guess two things are happening. Obviously, that's a tight time frame for turning the document around and getting them into the mailboxes to get to the voters. But, also, as technology advances, we can do things more and more quickly. I think, I don't have an objection to this. Obviously, we want this is an administrative issue. It's important that the ballots be correct and not rushed. And I think if this is causing a difficulty for counties to get the voter pamphlets turned around in time with only 9 days, we ought to address it. Most important thing is to make sure the information is correct. We don't want to be rushing that. And to give people enough time to submit their statements.
Right.
Their pro and con statements if they so choose.
Right, and I'm also thinking you really don't want to mail the voter information pamphlet too much ahead of the early ballots for fear people will lose them.
And it's a long time until Election Day now.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we appreciate Randy and Judy for the information that you provided. There's a lot of food for thought for people. The elections process isn't as simple as it used to be. It was pretty sure you were going to pass and you just had it and went from there. There's a lot of things for people to be thinking about because they are very important. I believe the last time I looked on M&O overrides, it's about 120 districts have them. So it affects a lot of districts in the states. Probably over half of when you look at districts, because a lot of the districts have the small school adjustment. But so there are very important issues for districts, and overrides have gotten very important on your day-to-day operations. And we do appreciate Ernie and his technical assistance. This webinar has been recorded, and the link will be posted on our ASBO website and one on the ASBA website. And just one last thing, I want to remind the ASBO members that our January bi-monthly meeting is now scheduled for January 15th, rather than it was originally scheduled for the 8th. But as we looked at it, it was really too close to the end of the break. So make sure you mark on your calendar for the January ASBO bi-monthly meeting, January 15th. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.